Welcome to the Virginia Insider Podcast, where we talk to the people who make our coastal region stand out from the rest of the world. I am your host, Chandler Nunnally, and our guest today is a pop culture journalist and critic who writes for Episodic Medium, a newsletter that features a collection of great writers from all over the internet, writing about the sprawling landscape that is TV in 2025. He's also a professor at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. Myles McNutt, welcome to Virginia Insider.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it is great to have you here, Myles. You know, I first heard your name years ago when you were writing about Game of Thrones for the AV Club. You were writing the expert book reader analysis for that show. How important would you say Game of Thrones is in the grand scope of your career?
I think what's interesting is sort of, I first read the Game of Thrones books when I was a teenager. I should not have been reading them at that age, to be honest with you, in context. And so they were always sort of something that really formed that perspective. And what happened was I started a blog in 2007 when I was an undergraduate student. And it was very much just, what am I going to write about, right? It was a time when you started a blog, right? There was a moment in time that was what you did. And so I started it, and I'm like, what am I going to care about? And TV was the thing I cared about. I was an English major in college. It was something that I could kind of like factor into that of ways of thinking about literature, and I was applying to TV in a way that I really enjoyed. And so Game of Thrones, when they announced the adaptation was coming, they first started casting it and engaging with it. I had this moment of like, this is like all my things converging, right? This book series that I cared about, combining with the interest in TV I was developing. At that time, I'd started a PhD in media and cultural studies in Wisconsin. And when I was doing that, I realized, I was like, this is so interesting what they're doing with this show, that there's something about the way they're responding to the fans, connecting with them and engaging with them. And so, while yes, we could say like, I wrote these very popular reviews that were read by hundreds of thousands of people, and that's a part of a career and a trajectory. But a big part of it is I wrote about the show in this very academic way at the beginning and just talking about the way that worked. And someone from HBO reached out to me and was basically just like, hey, like, we really like what you're talking about here. You're talking about it in a different way. We had these really cool things planned. And so still to my day in my office, there's this scent box that they sent out to kind of critics and journalists where they created the scents of Westeros from Game of Thrones. And you could smell them and pull them together. And everything's like a real like thing. And it's this great little object that says so much that I get to analyze and think about on a different level. And so I look at it, that part, even though it's much more minor and kind of when I was still just blogging for free, basically, as being really sort of connected to that. And then big reading, because I wrote a book about Game of Thrones that you can find in bookstores everywhere, coffee table book type thing. But at the same time, it's like no one show. TV is so sprawling, like you said, can fully represent that. But it's definitely a big part of it in terms of how I came to be where I am.
Can I ask you about the timeline of this? Because would you say the culmination of it is your book, A Guide to Westeros and Beyond? That's an official book.
That is an official book. That was a partnership with HBO in which they were working with a publisher, Chronicle Books, to effectively like memorialize the show. And that was a very interesting experience on multiple levels, I would say. But the chief among them was that I was writing it while the final season was airing. Yeah. So every week I'd be on the phone with the editors like, okay, who died this week? What do we need to change? Like, what happens here? Like, I remember after the finale, we had a very like meeting of just like, okay, this changes so many things we need to address and kind of work with. But no, definitely sort of was a capper on it. And I think, you know, that book doesn't reflect everything that I feel about it because it was an official book. I don't get to be as critical as maybe I want to be in all cases. But it was a chance to sort of reflect on, again, you know, the cultural meaning of these things. My blog, when I started, was called Cultural Learnings. And it was very much an effort to sort of argue for the cultural value of TV as a medium. And so I do think the book accomplishes that, even if there are things I would like to maybe poke at a bit more, I wasn't able to.
When you shifted from writing on, you know, cultural learnings to writing professionally for the AV Club, was that a turning point for you personally?
I mean, look, I pretended to be a TV critic for a long time before I became one. And I always sort of like talked about what is the distinction between those things. And I think the best way to understand it is that you suddenly have an audience, right, of scale that you're operating with. And for me, what really changed was like, I took that so seriously that I had an audience that I was engaged with. I spent hours in the comment sections after reviews were published, talking with them and engaging with them. Terrible idea. No one should ever do that. Stay out of the comments. It's a bad plan. But I think what it told me was that like, that's the value, right? The value is a community of connecting with people and really being engaged with that. So yeah, like it's professional, you're getting paid to do it, you're connecting, but it's the connection, right? Of being able to be a part of that conversation, of feeling like your reviews were part of a dialogue with other critics, with regular viewers. That to me, just the scale of that was always what I was aiming for and what I was trying to accomplish. And so to have been able to do that for as many years as I did at the AV Club, being able to extend that to my own publication now with other contributors has really been the part of it that I've most connected with, and the part that in many ways I tie to my teaching. Right? There's a pedagogical function to writing about these things for an audience. Like, I'm trying not to be full professor mode, right? I'm not full PhD when I'm writing in an online setting, but I'm trying to merge those worlds. I'm trying to argue for the value of like exploring the significance of television and of media in general in ways that people can connect with, which is a lesson I give my students, but also one that I think I'm kind of probably teaching too much when I write, but I do think that's a part of what I'm doing there as well.
I would wholeheartedly agree. I reread yesterday your review of the final episode of Game of Thrones. I was surprised at how positive you were about it, just because in the years since, so that episode came out in 2019, in the years since the finale of Game of Thrones, the public opinion has been so sour about that show, and you actually had a really balanced opinion on it. Hey, it's not perfect, but there are some real highlights here, and actually this sort of conflict and the fact that this isn't perfect, but that it's sort of commenting on itself, that your opinion, and I don't want to mischaracterize your words, but was that did sort of sum up what the Song of Ice and Fire series was all about. Do you still reflect on the show in a fond way?
Yeah, so I mean, like, look, the thing about writing any kind of criticism is, like, you have to think, like, what is this review going to read like in 5 years or 6 years, as it's been since the Game of Thrones finale, right? Like, I'm writing that very aware of the fact, like, it has to stand up to that. And so there's values to immediate reactions. But, like, I always like to try to think, like, reflect on a larger kind of question of, like, how are we going to look at this away from the immediate response, right? The immediate piece of this. I think some of it is that I just liked it better than other people did. But I think it's also part of it is, like, what is the goal of criticism? Like, what am I trying to accomplish? Is it that I'm trying to, like, make a polemic argument, right? Where I'm basically just like, this is like, I need to stand on this was bad, etc. But I think a lot of cases just trying to understand, like, what are the logics operating here? What do they tell us about the show, its legacy? And I think for me, the Game of Thrones finale is deeply imperfect. I think it makes a huge bunch of fast forwards and leaps in logic to make all that happen. But I also think that there is an internal logic to it in terms of what the show is and what the story represents and the circumstances therein that I do ultimately sort of stand behind. When I wrote for the AV Club, I had to give everything a letter grade, and I hated that because I'm just like, no, it's a nuanced perspective, right? Of like various, contradictory ideas all building together. And so I think that in that moment, I do think that there's a value from a critical perspective to being not like an uncritical voice, but a moderating one in terms of like engaging with what our opinions say and what we can kind of do with them. So, I will stand by that review. Admittedly, though, I've never at any point in time thought, I want to go rewatch that episode of TV. In part, I think it's a different era, but also just like of being able to sort of think about that as a moment in time. And that's really what criticism is designed to do, is to capture the moment we're in. And I also try to speak to where the future's heading.
I thought something else that was interesting about it was that you had published it at, I believe, 2:03 a.m.
Mm-hmm. No, and this is sort of something I talk about with contributors all the time, where it's like, look, I say it's like we were in the trenches in the early days of TV criticism, because like you're racing for search engine optimization to get your recap up as soon as possible. Like that review needs to come immediately. And I was trained to write really fast as a result. And I was just like, no, you move quickly, you take your first perspective, you write on it, you go. And like I've written probably at this point thousands of TV reviews. So like it's logical that would work. And when I have new contributors now that I'm working with at Episodic Medium who just started doing this, they'll be like, oh, I want to rewatch the episode before I give my review. And it's like, you don't have time to do that.
Yep.
But you do, right? I'm not actually trying to rush them, but I'm just realizing that different mindset. And so, yeah, those Game of Thrones reviews, like I watched that episode by myself, but like I watched one episode at my cousin's house a few weeks before that. And like immediately I'm just like, okay, bye. Went to the bedroom I was sleeping in and was just like typing away. And kind of knowing that when you do that, you are one of, in my case, dozens of TV critics who I know, who are my friends, who are all doing exactly the same thing. And there's a community aspect to that. So like every time I'm writing by myself for like 3 hours into the middle of the night to try to accomplish something and reflect on something, I kind of know that I'm then going to be a part of a conversation. So I'm deeply isolated and focused, but knowing that after that it opens up, it becomes this larger thing. So definitely a part of the job that I still engage with on occasion. I'm sure that I have a Traitors finale I have to write about on Thursday. There's Severance coming up. There'll be more examples of that to look forward to.
So many outlets where that sort of writing and discourse used to happen don't exist anymore. in 2025. And it's only been a few years, but just that sort of media sphere has really gone through a big shift. Is that part of why you decided to create Episodic Medium and sort of create your own space where that can live on?
I mean, there's a few reasons going into this. So Episodic Medium was celebrating its third anniversary pretty much right now. And like, I started it in part because there were issues at the AV Club at the time, which remains one of the dominant publications doing this, which is now under new editorial management. We're all very happy about that. But very much, there's very few sites that are doing it. And it really felt like we had this like golden age of writing about TV where everybody wanted to recap everything. And it's like, that's not sustainable. Right? It's not a sustainable marketplace. It's all ad driven. All these publications were like, why are we doing this? And even then, like, I benefited, like, if you go back to like 2013, which was 12 years ago, that's terrifying. That experience, like, we were writing about TV shows at the AV Club, and we were just writing about everything. Shows that nobody was watching, but it's like, well, this is important. And like, it is important. I completely believe that to be true. But I think the money never made sense. And so a big part of Episodic Medium was knowing that I wanted to keep doing this, that I believe it is valuable and the people deserve to be paid to do it. And that was just my goal, to do something very small, minor, that gave me an outlet in the way I wanted to. And then it kind of grew enough that we brought contributors in. Donna Bowman, who wrote about Breaking Bad for the AV Club, came on to write about Better Call Saul's final season. And all of a sudden people were like, well, we want a space like this, right? We want to be able to recreate what we had. We want that nostalgia for this kind of environment. And so it's partly a lack of outlets for people to read it, but it's really a space for people to gather. We've seen what's been happening with Twitter, right, and the collapse of some of these social spaces people relied on to talk about TV. And I think that it became a space that just the circumstances allowed for that to be where it is. It's not some giant media empire, right? It's still not making me deeply wealthy, but it's giving me that space that I want, right? And creating that and being a part of that has been a deep privilege. And it's also, I think, rekindled my connection to the value of this work and being able to extend that value by bringing in contributors, by working with them as an editor, I hope is kind of, solidifying the future of this form while acknowledging that, like, TV reviews are not the most important thing in the world, but I think that TV is a valuable part of culture, and I think being able to reflect on that and engage with that is a crucial part of the online discourse.
Where did you grow up, Myles?
I grew up in Nova Scotia, so Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada, so on Canada's east coast, Canada's ocean playground to be specific. And so I did my bachelor and master's there at Acadia University. And so that was kind of where I got a start in thinking about TV, but always as this like weird object off to the side of where that's at. I forced a medievalist, my undergraduate advisor, to let me write about Battlestar Galactica on my undergraduate thesis. And he was very resistant, but he liked Battlestar Galactica. And so he was like, I mean, I'm not against it, but like, what are you even trying to do? And so I made this pitch of like trying to figure that out and work with it. And I think it was kind of the starting point of how to kind of merge those two worlds that I was engaged with.
Mm. And then did the blog come after that?
The blog was before that. The blog was kind of the extracurricular that kind of like pushed me into that point, because that was conversations that were happening at pretty much the same time. What was weird in many ways was that I honestly was not a huge TV person as a kid. I watched lots of TV shows, big Simpsons fan, but like I wasn't like I need to watch everything. I wasn't consuming the older shows. I was just basically watching what was given to me in a lot of cases. And I think what happened, to be honest with you, I went to college in the era, don't tell anybody, where we torrented all television.
Right.
And it's just like, piracy as a form at that stage gave you access to everything, right? When, we didn't have cable in dorms anyway, but it's so easy to access just everything and sample and engage and build community. And so it's weird in that way that like I pay for TV now, I promise. But like at the end of the day, the sort of the moment of piracy that I came to college in was a tremendous sort of asset. Our school had, T1 lines in every dorm room. And so we just had such easy access to everything. And 2004, 2005 was Lost, Desperate Housewives, Veronica Mars, a very pivotal year in sort of the trajectory of that era of TV, and a really dynamic time to start thinking about it and experiencing it.
When you think about your students now, what challenges do they face as creatives that are trying to enter the professional world? It's so different.
It's so interesting. So I teach a course called Understanding Media. It's like our kind of starting point for all of our communication majors. And obviously they're going into all those different disciplines. Some of them want to work in TV. Others want to just communicate with people. Some of them want to be strategic communicators and marketers, et cetera. And as I'm talking to them, what I'm realizing more than anything is that teaching them how the industry functions is so critical. And one of the things I think about when I think about criticism is like, look, I came from a literary criticism background as an English major, but one of the things that media criticism to me has to do is confront the industrial reality in which these things are being made. It's like, why was Game of Thrones final season kind of weird? It's like, because they split it up very strangely, because everybody involved didn't want to keep making the show, and they shortened everything down and had to condense and sort of deal with how to manage the fact that a show that they would have gladly aired for 3-4 seasons was not sustainable with the actors and creatives in terms of making that happen. That matters to our understanding of what we're seeing and how it plays out. And I think getting that lesson across to students is very eye-opening about like the economic realities of making media, about the sort of cultural realities of making media in these environments, about thinking about issues of representation and inclusion and the way they function in these ways. And so it's just kind of like, to a certain degree, a very bleak message about creativity and how those things function, but I think it's a valuable message for helping them prepare to navigate that and to sort of confront that. And so I think in a lot of ways, what I'm getting across to them is both like the power of media and its meaning and the ways we can think about it, but also just acknowledging the sort of contentious future that they're in for, and helping them hopefully be better sort of communicators of and interpreters of that reality.
I think there's this pervasive notion that young people don't want to watch films, or that they can't because they have short attention spans, right? Or that they don't watch traditional media like television shows. Because of things like TikTok and other social media. Do you find that to be true? You see young people on the daily?
So what I would say is that in general, to an extent, yeah, there's certainly some of my students who I don't think watch a lot of traditional content, and they'll talk about that. But like, two things I would say to that. One, some of them are literally watching movies and TV shows cut up into TikToks. Like, they'll just, like, watch the entirety of an episode of Young Sheldon broken up into, like, 12 TikToks. And I'm always just like, y'all are based if you really think that that's the thing you should be doing, but that's your own choice. It's fine. What I think for me is, the reality, though, is, like, but TikTok is media, right? TikTok is narrative. TikTok is storytelling. Like, I say all the time, like, the content creator that I bring into class by Zoom, and it's like, look, he might be making very basic videos, but like, he's still telling stories, he's still building relationships, he's still thinking about style and the ways we kind of work. And so I recently taught a course about kind of critical analysis of communication, which is basically a media criticism course, kind of teaching them kind of to do what I do. And in doing that, like, I want them to have the option to talk about content creators, to talk about the stuff that's happening online, to talk about podcasts, to talk about all these different media forms that don't look the same as what we would normally analyze, but which follow the same logics. Even something like video games. You know, ODU has a very, diverse game design program, and a lot of those students take our comm courses. And like, hearing them talk about these things, it's like, no, but games are just as valid as a way of understanding these media forms and narrative and all these pieces, but there's also their own distinct industrial realities that kind of build off of that. And so as much as like there's that part of me where it's like, yeah, like, I wish more of my students came in being like, well, I don't really watch movies. Like, you should watch movies. Movies are great. But at the same time, like, if they're engaged with TikTok, they're still connecting, right, with media objects in a way that reflects them, their demographic, their experience. And I want to be able to kind of take that experience and tie it into, right, how we talked. It's, it goes like radio to TV to podcasts to, content and TikTok and Instagram, the lineage between those things, the connection between them. We say all the time in media studies that, like, every media was new once, right? And just because something feels so new in the moment doesn't mean we didn't think about podcasts the same way at first, right? That we didn't think about TV in the same way at first. That we just need to think about that trajectory and that dynamic in a way that makes sense.
The same thing that I noticed in your Game of Thrones review from 6 years ago, I'm hearing in your voice now. It's an optimism. Would you say that you're optimistic about the future?
I'm not sure I would say that. Maybe that's me being cynical about optimism, which I suppose would make sense. What I would say is that I think you have to be, right? There has to be a certain degree of, like, in thinking about media studies, of just like acknowledging the potential damage or issues of a certain thing, to sort of acknowledge like the resilience of certain forms, right? We think about all of the change that's happened in television and all the collapse of elements of linear media and all these different pieces, but then you watch a TV show and you're just sort of like, but this is so powerful, right? This is making such a statement. This is breaking through. And even if it's the exception, it suggests that there's still that kernel of something there, right? There's still that potential. And I think that it's very easy at times to sort of view things through the cynical lens of broken institutions and the inability for us to really address systemic issues at the root of them. And I do think it's important, like, I'm talking to my students about representation in media this week, and it's sort of like, the thing to always remember is that we can talk optimistically about, progress, for example, trans individuals in media. I show a documentary called Disclosure on Netflix that addresses this. And it feels like this very linear narrative progression, like it's constantly getting better. We have, prominent figures like Laverne Cox, starring in TV shows talking about transness as a meaningful part of society. And it's like, that's all great. And so if we look at it linearly, we are so optimistic. But then we look at the reality we live in and we realize, this doesn't work in a linear way, right? This is setbacks and different trajectories and sort of offsets. And as that plays out, the goal is not to say, we're screwed, right? Like, we're never going to get progress. It's the idea that it's a fight. It's the idea it's a constant struggle. And so I think that ultimately where my optimism comes from is that we are constantly sort of battling with, right, and fighting against this, that we're part of a dialogue and conversation about where TV is headed, where society is headed, how culture moves, and that provided we're kind of willing to stay in that fight, like, that's the benefit of media literacy. It's the kind of core principles that we teach. Now, with Game of Thrones, that functions a little bit differently because we're not talking about the same big issues, but there's still this sort of idea of sort of wanting to say, hey, like, this isn't just about a TV show and its ending. It's about, like, the challenge of serialized storytelling, the challenge of adapting a book series that isn't finished, right? Remembering and reminding ourselves that the context of all these different pieces gives us some insights, and that the goal is not to make definitive statements. It's to think about, hey, what happens the next time that happens, right? Like, how do we learn from that? Like, where does that sort of come from? And I know I've said on multiple occasions, appearing on Coast Live, that, like, change happens very weirdly and there's no guarantees about how people pay attention, but you need to believe in it. Like, I think there needs to be a notion that change can happen. And so as we confront challenges like AI and its impact on the media industries, sort of acknowledging, like, we've been here before, right? And we need to think about the specifics of that, but also address how we can sort of confront that moving forward.
That's powerful. Let me ask you this. I think that you have one of the coolest jobs in the world. I got into media because I was enamored reading the writings of you and your colleagues and listening to you guys on podcasts, and just the evaluation and the discussion of these shows, and really discussing them as art that deserved to be discussed. That really captured my brain, right? And that's why I got into this space. So for somebody that has that view, listening to you talk about this, and they're just enamored with that, what would you say to somebody who wants to get into that career field?
It's one of those difficult things, because it's sort of like, on the one hand, it's like I talk to media students all the time, and it's like, well, what do you do? Like, I teach in a media studies program, and it's like, well, what is that? And it's like, well, first off, media is everything, right? Like, so much of media, like, our students are often, going into different areas, whether that's news, whether that's marketing, et cetera. And you think, well, it's a media studies degree, but, like, so much of it is an understanding of, like, how platforms operate, right? How these industries interconnect with each other, those different relationships. I think those are really valuable skills for adapting to an increasingly mediated landscape in which we operate. And as a result of that, I think that it's valuable base skills for all those understandings. And ODU, I stand by our program. It's my program, so of course I stand by it. But, like, I really think we do a good job of preparing people for the mediated reality that we're operating in. But at the same time, we're talking about areas, whether it's journalism, academia, which are all suffering in the same way as all areas are, in terms of an overpopulation of individuals, a lack of jobs, challenges of funding, et cetera. And so as a result of that, I would never be like, do what I did, because you can't, right?
Not anymore.
You can't do that in that way. And, like, I have the very much privilege I want to acknowledge of the fact that, like, not only do I have the privilege of having gotten a PhD, gone to grad school, and I'm a tenured professor, I have the stability at the core of that, meaning that I've never experienced what so many journalists have experienced, which is uncertainty of freelancing, layoffs, like, all the different challenges that come with that. And I don't get to worry about that. I just get to do what I do. And that is something that you don't always get to manage. And so if I had a piece of advice, it's to kind of find whatever kind of security makes you feel good. If that's uncertainty, great. Like, be in your uncertainty, that's fine. But to find ways to sort of channel your interest in media in either the work that you're doing, right? Of taking a job that you have and finding ways to sort of integrate those interests and kind of capture them and go from there. Or conversely, like doing it as a hobby, as a thing you can follow. Open a Letterboxd account, right? Start posting on Blue Sky, right? Start a newsletter. Like, do any of these things that are just kind of like, I want to explore this. I want to think about it in that relationship. That is all I did in 2007. At a very different time where blogging was a real thing and it could connect you to real people. And you have people like David Chen, who I know we've talked about, who just invited me on his podcast because he read my blog, right? And it's like, that's now a relationship that's 18 years later, right? Where I kind of work with him often. And so those are the types of things where it's like that community you can find and connect with. That's the value of it. And I think that that's not a career path. And I feel bad, all the time we think about like what college education is and what it works for. And it's like, I want to help my students get jobs, don't get me wrong, but like, I'm not equipped to do that, right? What I'm equipped to do is to give them skills and ways of thinking that I think will benefit them. And ultimately, that's what I think talking about this, even with your friends, with groups of people, can do. So, hey, start your own podcast, do the things that kind of make sense, but sort of acknowledge that the goal is to find a way that this is meaningful to you. And if that's a job, I have the great privilege that that's what I get to do. That's not always going to be available to people, but I think finding that can be very fulfilling.
Yeah. I think one way that I felt connected to it was by reading the opinions of people who I felt were smarter than me and equipped me with a lot of great knowledge, and listening to podcasts with brilliant people. And I think you qualify as a brilliant person. Myles, thank you so much for coming on this show today, man. It's been fascinating to talk to you. Episodic Medium is an excellent place to hear the ongoing discussion about the TV landscape. How can people access Episodic Medium if they're not already a subscriber, which you should be?
Yeah, so you can get to Episodic Medium, which is episodicmedium.substack.com. If you Google Episodic Medium, you will find the newsletter. I feel confident that Google will give it where you need to be in that respect, unless you get a weird AI summary that nobody wants. And then from there, you can subscribe there. And obviously, if anybody wants to specifically explore this academically, or if you're a high school student, which seems very unlikely that you're watching this, ODU's Media Studies program is very much built in the image of those goals and those ideas. So I'm always excited to see people come in who are kind of enthusiasts who really want to talk about this and engage with it, because I think that those are the people who can really make a difference in terms of thinking about what media is and does in the future.
Myles, it's been a brilliant discussion. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Again, you can find me, along with my co-host April Woodard, every weekday at 9 a.m. on Coast Live at WTKR and WTKR.com. The Virginia Insider Podcast is presented by WTKR and WGNT in the Southeast Virginia region and Northeast North Carolina. I am Chandler Nunnally. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Virginia Insider. We will see you next week.